Hello, my name is Daniel Armanios, and I'm the BT Professor of Major Program Management at the Said Business School and a Professorial Fellow at St. Anne's College. I'm thrilled to get to know you, albeit virtually, through this Meeting Minds Global Summit. In this short video, I will discuss one strand of my work that I find especially meaningful: the complex connection between our history of racial and gender inequality and injustice and our infrastructure systems. As a content warning, this talk will discuss some recent tragedies due to persistent inequities in our infrastructure. While I find these stories help better crystallize and personalize for the listener, you, the human consequences that can arise from biases in our infrastructure systems, this may be triggering to some audiences. For us to better understand the potential connections between our infrastructure systems and inequality, we need to reconceptualize and re-envision how we characterize these systems. Typically, when we think of infrastructure, we focus on its physical embodiments. We may think of water, roads, electricity, and bridges. However, for us to better understand the connections with inequality, we need to think about the people and organizations that underlie said systems. For every water system, there is a municipal sewage and water authority who must interface with state authorities and even those in the federal government to operate, manage, and maintain these systems. Therefore, when we think about the role of infrastructure on inequality, we need to think about the people and organizations undergirding these infrastructure systems and not just their physical embodiment. So why does this matter? Because infrastructure impacts not just who uses the infrastructure system, but the communities that such systems intersect. In the case of the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York, which we see here, more than 1,500 families were displaced to build the 7-mile expressway. These were homes. These were lives through which this infrastructure cut right through. In Pittsburgh, where I spent a significant time of my academic career, the Hill District is one of the city's oldest communities. It began in the late 1840s when banker Thomas Mellon bought a tract of farmland on the slopes nearest the city and subdivided it into smaller lots. In subsequent years, successive waves of immigrants, including Jews, Italians, Syrians, Greeks, Poles, and finally African Americans, populated what is known as the Hill. This was a diverse and vibrant community. After World War II, during the city's Lower Hill redevelopment, 80 city blocks, or 100 acres, were cleared, and 8,000 residents, or 1/5 of the Hill's population at the time, were relocated to make way for the Civic Arena development project. What happens to these communities when they are displaced? Where do they go? Do they get the same benefits as they did before? Unfortunately, the data suggests that for these communities, their plight may actually worsen. In this study, published in the Journal of Construction Engineering and Management, we explore the statistical associations between communities of different racial demographics and our bridge systems. To interpret this graph, let's discuss below. Here is the zero line. To the right of that line means you are associated with new bridges. These bridges represent an avenue for more easily accessing opportunities, connecting meaningfully with those within and beyond the local community, and even to evacuate when disaster strikes. Let's return to this zero line. To the left means you are less statistically associated with new bridges. This represents even fewer avenues to engage with those around you and even fewer avenues to leave when natural disaster and their dangers are imminent. For communities in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania, with a greater percentage of Hispanic, African American, or black, non-white, and foreign-born constituents, these communities are associated with fewer bridges. And even when these communities receive a bridge, they are less likely to receive a non-restrictive one. Here again, the zero line To the right means you are more statistically associated with a non-restrictive bridge, whereby all vehicles can pass freely and safely. Again, the zero line. To the left, you are less associated with a non-restrictive bridge, which means vehicles such as some trucks carrying valuable produce to make dinner, or even machinery to start your business, and even some buses, which may represent your only means to get to work, are constricted and harder to access freely and safely. Here too, greater percentage of Hispanic, African American and or Black, and non-white constituents are less associated with a non-restrictive bridge. For these communities, they are not just associated with fewer bridges, they are associated with restrictive bridges, even when they get one. Our infrastructure system is not evenly accessible and distributed. It is skewed. You may ask, well, why does this matter? What are the implications of these biases in our infrastructure systems? Sadly, as our forthcoming publication Organization Science suggests, the indication is that disadvantaged communities may have a harder time accessing innovation opportunities made possible from these bridge systems. As you can see in this graph, even just one additional bridge, you see almost a 20% increase in high-tech founding rates. Across a series of analyses, we see that even high-tech founding rates, the novelty of these startups, and even those who participate in creating them, all increase. Bridges enhance the flow of ideas across previously disparate industries and groups that help spur novel innovation. A key mechanism that explains these findings are the very sidewalks on these bridges that allow for serendipitous encounters and learning that generate this novel entrepreneurial activity that represent a crucial means for social advancement. Whether developing new biotechnologies that will lead to our next path-breaking drugs, or the next computing applications that will enhance our ability to work and connect, bridges provide opportunities for potential technology entrepreneurs to be exposed to new sources of knowledge that can inspire these innovations. What this implies then is that the very biases and asymmetries in our infrastructure systems are making innovation opportunities more available to some, but not all. Who can participate in the high-tech economy and reap its benefits may be literally decided on the sidewalks of our world's bridges. Sadly, such inequalities are not just limited to race, to bridge systems, or even the United States. In this study that appeared in Nature Sustainability, we find gender inequality regarding energy access in India. In this graph, even after 10 years since receiving an initial electrical connection, households on average have 4 times as many male appliances as they do female appliances. We find this even occurs when restricting our analysis to only the most affordable appliances, namely fans and lights, for which nearly all households have more than one. Even these most basic appliances are more likely to be located in those parts of the house frequented by males than those parts of the house frequented by those who identify as females. So even the very placement of appliances is skewed within the household. What does this mean for new urban technologies, for example, such as our smart city planning systems? Our smart city planning systems are often optimized based on the traffic they can see, such as in this picture. What if there's a restrictive bridge along the path for which vehicles cannot flow? Could our planning systems then only further exacerbate these issues if based predominantly on past traffic. For instance, again in this image, far in the distance, there is only one bus. For those minority communities who often rely on such forms of public transportation and whose bridge systems have fewer and more restrictive bridges that make it more difficult to access such modes of transportation, will these city planning systems only continue to optimize flow for ever fewer buses based on the prior traffic they see? More generally, we need to ask ourselves, who are we optimizing for in our systems if we have infrastructure that restricts the movement of some and not all? Are we likely to have planning systems that effectively enhance the flow for all constituents, or just a few? Perhaps we need to consider methodologies and tools that penalize our smart planning systems for what these algorithms cannot see due to infrastructure biases and asymmetries, and not just the prior traffic they do see. While numbers and statistics are useful to generalize trends, to advance the science, I find actual human stories equally important and crucial for personalizing the steep toll our infrastructure biases exact on communities. We need to look no further than two stories to understand that toll. The first is the story of Raquel Nelson, the single mother of three who you see in this slide. Put yourself in the shoes of Raquel Nelson. You have had a long day at work. You are now going to get groceries for your children. You do not have a car, so that journey entails you taking a long bus ride. Perhaps even more than one bus ride. You have finally made it home. You are exhausted, and your children are hungry. And this is what you see. Pleasantdale Road in Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. You would like to take the most direct route home from the bus, but you have no sidewalks associated with pedestrian crossings or even lighting at this intersection. So what should otherwise be a simple direct crossing home becomes an arduous journey where you have to walk up a long street to the nearest lighted sidewalk and marked crossing, cross that street, and return back that long street to get home. An additional journey of more than half a mile on top of an already long and tiring bus journey. Understandably, your son AJ is impatient and wants to go home by the more direct, albeit less safe route. You're holding his hand tight, but in his rush to get home, he pulls away from you and runs into the bus intersection. And that's when tragedy strikes. AJ, your beautiful, sweet, loving boy, is hit by a drunk driver and dies. Is this absence of sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, and lighting an isolated event? Or does this absence reflect an unfair and unjust distribution of basic infrastructure for all citizens? When we look at the data around the number of sidewalks and street and sidewalk lighting, we see a tragedy that may not be limited to Atlanta, one city, or Raquel Nelson, one individual. As you can see in this graph, only 51% of streets in low-income communities have lighting, and only 49% of streets have sidewalks. In our second story, closer to Oxford, we also see how infrastructure can also restrict mobility in ways that can lead to catastrophic harms. On June 14th, 2017, a fire engulfed the Grenfell Tower Flats in North Kensington, West London. Eyewitnesses reported that some residents were so trapped that they jumped out of windows in a desperate attempt to escape the flames. Once the blaze was contained, 72 people had died and over 70 others were injured, a majority of which were people of color. This tragic event marked the deadliest residential blaze in the United Kingdom since World War II. Here too, we sadly see these risks are not limited to Grenfell residents, and there's one building in the social rented sector. Official housing surveys have found that 40% of high-rise residents in the social rented sector, such as buildings like this at Grenfell, are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, which make up 14% of the population, even though 40% of the residents occupy these buildings. How many other parents have lost their children due to the lack of sidewalks, the most basic of infrastructure? How many parents are harmed because they do not have even the most basic lighting to mark their path after a long day of work and errands? How many loved ones each year perish because they are in buildings without even basic emergency escape routes? What my work continually seeks to do is ask, how are we as engineers complicit in these asymmetries and biases, and how are we going to take the lead in solving these issues? So what can we do about this? I argued in a recent op-ed in Fortune that we can begin the process of righting these wrongs through 3 key steps. First, use, develop, and enforce equity metrics to guide infrastructure siting and replacement. Simply put, we need equity metrics that incorporate disadvantage and structural inequality directly into engineering decision-making. My studies provide one method that uses that, which is census demographic data, to ensure greater focus not just on what infrastructure is being built, but where and for whom. This would also better prioritize limited infrastructure funds. For instance, in the United Kingdom, estimates are that we have a £500 billion infrastructure funding gap. Thus, even at current funding levels, we have a backlog of infrastructure need. Including equity metrics to further prioritize this backlog to better identify the most pressing infrastructure projects does not just right historical wrongs. It is simply good business. Second, set ambitious targets for involving businesses run by underrepresented groups and/or disadvantaged communities. For instance, the original plan from the Biden administration in the US wanted 40% of climate and clean infrastructure investment benefits to go to disadvantaged communities. However, even then, investments could be steered to wealthier communities under the guise of advancing these benefits. To prevent that from happening, we should set ambitious targets tied more directly to the disadvantaged communities that we seek to support. For instance, why not set that 40% target for contracting to local disadvantaged business enterprises? Currently, the United States Department of Transportation uses a 10% target for infrastructure projects. Here again, this makes economic sense. For instance, in past studies, I identified local skills as a key factor that influences the sustainability of rural water systems. If aforementioned equity metrics are coupled with training that cultivates local skills, infrastructure plans could potentially make a profound and lasting impact for the better on disadvantaged communities. Third and finally, legally enforce community review processes that hold development projects accountable. When acquiring development rights to the area, developers must be required to work with local community organizations to develop a community benefits agreement to ensure development benefits are shared with the community, as well as a community review process to ensure block by block, project by project accountability to this plan. Moreover, local and national governments should stringently enforce these plans. So when developers do not meet their mutually agreed upon targets, such projects will not be allowed to proceed until mutually agreed milestones are once again met to prevent circumvention of that review process. If we can begin with these 3 initial steps, we can hopefully better ensure a more resilient and inclusive infrastructure system where disadvantaged communities are given a seat at the table rather than continue to be excluded from it. Thank you for listening to this brief foray into my research, and I hope that it made you think differently about infrastructure through helping to unearth the complicated social legacy of these systems in ways that permeate and persist beyond their brick, mortar, and steel. Once again, I am so thrilled to be joining you for this virtual event, and I hope this is an enriching time for you as you reconnect with Oxford and the St. Anne's community. Please do not hesitate to contact me if anything I have spoken about today is of further interest. Hope you have a wonderful day and summit.